The British Empire was never one empire. It was three: a company chasing profit, families taking land to live on, a government seizing whole countries by force. They ran at the same time under one flag. Here is how each one worked. The first was a business. It came first back in the 1600s. The second was ordinary families. They moved in and took the land for themselves. That spread out over 200 years. The third was conquest by force. It was packed into just a few decades at the end of the 1800s, mostly in Africa. These three ran side by side for a long time. They fed into each other. By the early 1900s, they had merged into one system. One flag flew over all of it. To see how it was built, you have to start with the company. It came first, and it explains all the rest. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a piece of paper. It gave a group of London merchants the only legal right to trade with Asia. The company was called the East India Company. At first, it was exactly what it sounds like, a business. It sailed ships out for spices, silk, and tea. It sold them back home for a profit. But moving valuable goods across oceans is risky. Ships and warehouses need protection, so the company built its own private army. Over the next 100 years, that army kept growing. It grew far past anything a normal business would ever need. In 1757, everything changed. At a place called Plassey in eastern India, the company's army won a battle. Its leader was a man named Robert Clive. He defeated the ruler of Bengal. After that win, the company stopped being just a trading business. It started collecting taxes from Bengal directly. It started governing millions of people. It started acting like a government, but it answered to shareholders sitting in London. It did not answer to the people it now ruled. The army kept growing too. Now, by the middle of the 1800s, it held between 200,000 and 280,000 soldiers. That was larger than the entire British Army at the time. Think about what that means. A company that started out selling tea now ran a huge stretch of land. Tens of millions of people lived on it, and its only real goal was still to make money for its owners back home. The company reshaped whole economies to fit its profits. In Bengal, it pushed farmers to grow opium instead of food. Then it shipped that opium to China. It sold it there even after China banned it. That trade helped trigger a war between Britain and China. The whole arrangement finally broke in 1857. Indian soldiers serving under the company rose up in rebellion. It spread fast across northern India. Fighting lasted more than a year. Then the British government stepped in with its own troops. Once the rebellion was crushed, the government did not just punish the rebels, it ended company rule completely. In 1858, the British Crown took direct control of India. The company limped on with no real power. It was finally shut down for good in 1874. That was more than 200 years after it started. So the trading empire was finished, but a very different empire had already been growing. It was on the other side of the world. It was not built by merchants chasing profit. It was built by ordinary families leaving home for good. That second operation started in 1607. A small group of English settlers landed in Virginia. They built a town called Jamestown. This was never about controlling trade from a distance. It was about people moving in and staying. Over the next 2 centuries, more families kept crossing the ocean. They spread across the eastern coast of North America. They built farms, towns, and whole colonies. Britain also used this method to solve another problem. It needed somewhere to send its prisoners. Its American colonies broke away in 1776. So Britain picked Australia instead. Starting in 1788, ships began carrying convicts across the world. The first fleet held around 780 convicts. Add the guards and officials, and it was over 1,000 people in total. These were not small trading posts. They were whole growing communities of British people, farmers, tradesmen, and former prisoners. They built permanent lives in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of southern Africa. And because they wanted permanent homes, they needed the land itself, not just the right to trade across it. That meant pushing out the people who already lived there. In North America, Australia, and New Zealand, the same thing happened. Settlers seized land. New diseases spread that local people had never faced before. Violent conflict followed. The death tolls are still debated by historians today. They differ hugely depending on the region and the decade, but in every one of these places, the losses to native populations were severe and lasting. Over time, these settler colonies grew large. They were British enough in population to ask for something. They wanted the same political rights people had back home. Canada got self-government in 1867. Australia followed in 1901. New Zealand followed in 1907. In each case, Britain was not fighting to hold on. It was letting go of people it saw as close to itself, close in background, close in loyalty. It never did that with India or Kenya. This was a completely different kind of empire. Like, the company ruled distant people from an office in London. The settlers did not rule from a distance at all. They moved in and replaced the people who were already there. But not every piece of land worked this way. In some places already had large populations. Those people had no interest in leaving. There was no open land for families to settle, and no company could simply buy its way in. For places like that, Britain turned to a third method, force. That third operation peaked in the 1880s. European countries started racing each other. Each wanted to claim as much of Africa as it could. They wanted it before their rivals got there first. This race moved so fast that historians call it the Scramble for Africa. In 1884 and 1885, European powers met in the city of Berlin. Britain, France, and Germany were all there. They divided up the entire African continent between themselves. They drew borders on a map in a conference room. Not a single African leader was present, not one. Britain then moved to take direct control of specific places. It used military force or heavy political pressure that included Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. This was different from both the company and the settlers. It was not businessmen chasing profit. It was not families searching for a home. This was the government sending soldiers to seize land. Then it ruled that land directly through appointed officials. One example shows how far this went. The Second Boer War was fought in South Africa between 1899 and 1902. It was against Dutch-speaking settlers called Boers. They had built their own republics there. During that war, the British Army rounded up Boer civilians, mostly women and children. They were held in camps meant to cut off support for Boer fighters. Conditions inside were terrible. Between 20,000 and 28,000 of them died. Most died from disease and hunger. Alongside them, Britain also held black African people in separate camps. An estimated 14,000 to 20,000 died there. Those deaths were recorded far less carefully at the time. The true number is still not fully known today. Resistance to conquest was common. It was not always quickly crushed. In what is now Sudan, British forces fought for years. They finally won at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. They used machine guns against soldiers armed mostly with spears and older rifles. The result was completely lopsided. Around 10,000 Sudanese fighters were killed. Fewer than 50 British and Allied soldiers died. By 1914, Britain directly controlled around 30 separate territories in Africa alone. This was empire built on nothing but force. No trade route to protect. No family looking for a home. Only land taken and held by soldiers. By the early 1900s, all three operations had merged. The leftover lands of the old company, the growing settler colonies, the newly conquered lands in Africa, all of it flew the same flag. And that combined system was about to be tested. Two wars were coming, large enough to break almost anything. The first test was the First World War. The fighting ran from 1914 to 1918. It drained Britain of money and soldiers, but strangely, the empire came out of the war larger than ever. In 1922, a group called the League of Nations gave Britain new lands to run. They used to belong to the defeated Ottoman Empire in Germany. That included Iraq and Palestine. On paper, this was the biggest the empire would ever get. It stretched across roughly a quarter of the world's land. It held somewhere between 412 and 458 million people. Historians still argue over that figure. It depends on how you count. But something had changed underneath. Over 1.3 million soldiers from India had fought and died for Britain. So had soldiers from Africa and the Caribbean. Once the fighting ended, one question would not go away. If people from India, Kenya, and Nigeria die for the empire, why don't they have the same rights as people in Britain? That question did not fade. It grew louder over the following years. It fed independence movements across India, Africa, and the Middle East. In India, a lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi returned from South Africa in 1915. He began building a movement based on peaceful, organized resistance. Over the next decades, it would grow into the force that ended British rule there. So the empire's largest moment on the map came in 1922. That same moment, its foundation started to crack. Now for the part most people get wrong. The easy explanation is simple. People in the colonies wanted freedom, and eventually they got it. That is true. But it leaves out the interesting part. People had wanted freedom for decades before they got it. So the desire for independence was not what changed. What changed was Britain's ability to pay for control at all. The numbers tell the story. The Second World War left Britain owing around £3.5 billion by 1945. On top of that, Britain went to the United States in 1946. It took out a loan of $3.75 billion just to keep its economy running. It did not finish paying that loan off until 2006. The United States was now the world's strongest economy, and it did not support the idea of colonial empires. It made that clear while helping rebuild Europe after the war. Meanwhile, Britain was trying to do too much at once. It had to rebuild its own bombed cities. It had to feed its own people. It had to pay off a huge war debt. And it was still trying to keep armies across colonies on nearly every continent. The math made the choice. Keeping an army in India alone had cost enormous sums every year. After 1945, that cost had to compete with rebuilding London and Coventry. German bombing had hit those cities for years. Britain could not do both. Eventually, it had to choose, so the empire did not collapse because Britain lost a war to keep it. It collapsed because 2 world wars left the country too poor. Too poor and too stretched thin to hold on to any of it. What followed was not one clean ending, it was several. They spread out across 5 decades. The first came in 1947. India became independent. It was immediately split into 2 new countries, India and Pakistan. That split was called partition. It forced millions of people to leave homes their families had lived in for generations. They had to cross a brand new border drawn along religious lines. The violence that followed killed somewhere between 200,000 and over 2 million people. Historians still cannot narrow that range down. A second wave of endings came across Africa. Ghana became independent in 1957. It was led by a politician named Kwame Nkrumah. It was the first country south of the Sahara to break away from British rule. That moment mattered far beyond Ghana. It proved to every other colony watching that independence was possible. More African nations followed fast. Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. This wave was not always peaceful. In Kenya, British forces spent years fighting an independence movement. It was known as the Mau Mau Uprising from 1952 to 1960. Official records at the time listed around 11,000 deaths. Later research suggests the real number was likely far higher. A third ending came in 1956 at the Suez Canal in Egypt. Britain tried to seize back control of the canal by force. Egypt had taken it over and declared it Egyptian property. Britain was forced to back down. The pressure came directly from the United States. It was a very public sign. The whole world watched. Britain was no longer one of the top powers on earth. The United States now decided what happened in large parts of the globe. The last widely recognized ending came on July 1st, 1997. Britain formally handed Hong Kong back to China. Many historians call that the final chapter of the empire. It makes a useful bookend. The story runs from a company chartered by a queen in 1600 to a handover on live television nearly 400 years later. None of these endings were tidy. Millions of people were displaced. New borders were drawn fast with little thought for the people living inside them. Some of those borders still cause conflict today, and the empire never fully disappeared. Today, 56 countries remain in a loose group called the Commonwealth. It is a leftover thread. It still connects nations that used to be ruled from London. So, the British Empire was never one thing. That is exactly why it is so hard to sum up in a sentence. It was a company that ruled for profit. It was families who settled land and replaced the people already there. It was a government that conquered territory by force. And for a long stretch, all three ran at once under a single flag. See it this way, and the whole thing makes sense. It explains why the empire looked so different depending on where you stood. Under company rule in India, in a settler colony in Australia, under direct military control in Kenya. And it explains why it fell apart. Once the money ran out, the reason for keeping it stopped making sense, even to the people running it. The British Empire was never one long story. It was three different ones, built for three different reasons. They just happened to end at roughly the same time.